Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 383. It's great to be back, 2 months away rather than one like I advertised. And this video might be a little bit longer than 10 minutes because just before I get to talking about Milt Jackson's great record, Plenty, Plenty Soul, I wanted just to do a little deviation to talk about some personal news that I have. Unlike most of my breaks, which are usually just to recharge my batteries, this one was for medical reasons. And if you want to skip this bit, then you could just go ahead to the review. It's bookmarked down below in the description. Anyway, at the end of this winter, I was diagnosed with something between stage 2 and stage 3 prostate cancer, so life has been a little more flavorful than usual. I was lucky. I had surgery right away. My prognosis is great. Recovery is going super well. To quote that 1970s Oldsmobile ad, this is not your father's prostatectomy. So life is good. Medical science is amazing. I'm so grateful, and this will not turn into a medical vlog. But knowing the demographics of my channel, which I have to say are amusingly almost entirely men between the ages of 45 and 70, well, not exclusively, but about 95%, I felt it would be remiss of me not to reach out a little bit about this, given that demographic. So, fellas, if you're over 50, please make an annual habit of talking to your doctor about getting screened for prostate cancer. It's a very dealable with disease. It's a very slow progressing disease, but you do have to detect it in order to be able to deal with it. Of course, even if you have it, and so many people get it, it's not necessarily clear that you would have to have some kind of radical intervention. There's all kinds of different paths, and I'm not here to proselytize about one or the other. But please have that conversation. For me, it basically saved my life. 6 months later would have been a bit of a different story. And whatever you do, don't stick your head in the sand and avoid the topic, especially if your dad or other family members have had it. All right? All right. Enough said. On with the review. So this is Milt Jackson's great record, Plenty, Plenty Soul, which came out on Atlantic in 1957. This is a first pressing. Milt Jackson, of course, you probably know as the vibraphone player from the Modern Jazz Quartet. Very, very prolific group, very popular group. And it's kind of strange that I haven't actually focused on him specifically so far in this channel after hundreds of videos, because he was really prolific outside the MJQ as well as within it. He's one of the most recorded jazz artists of all time, certainly probably the most recorded vibraphonist of all time. He was a prolific jazz composer. Most casual jazz fans can probably hum at least a few bars from his most famous composition, Bag's Groove. He was in big bands. He was in small groups. He recorded all-star dates. He was a great collaborator, and he recorded great music well into the 1980s. He was regularly in the studio in what was about a 50-year recording career. He made something like 39 records with the MJQ. Made 65 as a leader or a co-leader, again, roughly, and another couple dozen as a sideman. And this record is from what I think is probably his best period as a leader, from the mid-1950s to the early 1960s. It's an all-star date. It features superb arrangements and just a general overall collaboration with Quincy Jones, and it sounds fantastic, like so many Atlantic records from that period. Milt Jackson hailed from Detroit, where he was born on the 1st of January 1923. According to his own account and those of his peers and collaborators, he had both a near photographic memory and perfect pitch, and by the time he was 6 or 7, he was already picking out songs on the piano that he just heard on the radio one time. He played many different instruments growing up, including the piano and the guitar and others, and his early musical formation was basically in the church, which was where he would always say he got the funky grounding and origins of his sound. He was also talented vocally, and at age 16, he toured for a while with a gospel quartet called the Evangelist Singers. After trying a bunch of different instruments, in high school, encouraged by his band teacher, he ends up moving to the xylophone and the marimba. He took to these like a duck to water, and in 1940, at age 17, he then goes to see a show at the State Fair featuring Lionel Hampton with his vibraphone and his all-star band. This blew Milt away, and his life really changed from that point forward. However, as a young man in the 1940s getting interested in playing the vibraphone, it was a bit of a problem of role models, because Lionel Hampton, his playing was fantastic, but the kind of music he was playing wasn't the bebop that young Milt was getting interested in. And the only other role model was a guy called Red Norvo, again, really a swing era figure. So Milt basically had to forge his own path, not really modeling his style on either of those musicians. Without really any constraints or expectations because of this, he was able to basically set out his own style. He elected to play with 2 mallets rather than 4. I'm no vibist or vibe expert, but my understanding is that's essentially a choice between playing more as a lead or frontline instrument versus a rhythm instrument. And he shortened his mallets up as well. And he also, in a very Eddie Van Halen kind of moment, messes with his own vibraphone, and he opens it up and he messes with the motor which controlled the oscillator. Now, the oscillator is a device inside the vibraphone which affects the speed of vibrato, and he slowed his down, so it was about a third the speed of Lionel Hampton's. This created a more drawn-out vibrato style, which was suitable for ballads, also suitable for a more bluesy feel. And between 1940 and 1945, Jackson basically innovates a bluesy vibraphone jazz style for the first time. In the early 1940s, he begins to get jazz gigs. He gets a traveling gig for a while with a musician called George E. Lee, who used to run big bands in the 1930s. But of course, it was wartime, and in 1942, at age 19, he gets drafted into the Army, where he stays for 2 years. In 1944, when he's discharged, he goes right back to Detroit and starts making up for lost time. He forms his own quartet called the Four Sharps. By all accounts, in this year, 1944, 1945, he woodshedded like crazy. He worked nonstop. He was reluctant to sleep, and that's how he gets his nickname, Bags, so named for the bags under his eyes from lack of sleep. In 1945, he and the Four Sharps are playing at a jazz club in Detroit called the Sound Station. Dizzy Gillespie, who's in town, comes by to see them, is very impressed, and lures him off to New York to join Dizzy's band. And from 1945 to 1950, Jackson basically has his apprenticeship at the elite level of the jazz world, and he plays with all kinds of people, not just Dizzy, but also Coleman Hawkins, Thelonious Monk, Woody Herman, and a bunch of other folks. He can be heard on record from about 1946, appearing on a lot of sides with Dizzy's band and supporting Dinah Washington. Having bounced around working with all kinds of leaders, between 1950 and 52, he moved back to work with Dizzy. Dizzy at this point had scaled down his big band and was working with a sextet. But at the same time, he'd progressed enough to feel like he wanted to spread his wings as a leader as well. In this period, Baggs and 3 other members of Dizzy's band, Ray Brown on bass, John Lewis on piano, and Kenny Clark on drums, would regularly play little quartet sets in between the sets of the main band. They ended up formalizing this arrangement, first as the Milt Jackson Quartet, because they were primarily playing his bluesy originals at the start. But that changed quite quickly. Ray Brown left to join Oscar Peterson, in came Percy Heath on bass, and they rebranded themselves the Modern Jazz Quartet. There was no real science to that. They weren't posing as the imaginers or inventors of modern jazz. Apparently, it was actually just the easiest thing they could find to incorporate themselves, which was actually kind of an unusual thing to do as a group in those days. Anyway, that's a whole other story. In fact, the MJQ is a whole separate conversation. And suffice it to say, while the members of that group, people like Milt, obviously, like John Lewis, like Connie Kay and the others, are all widely respected as musicians, their approach wasn't necessarily for everyone. It began, as I mentioned, as a vehicle for Jackson's funky compositions, but soon third stream ideas begin to creep in, and this concept emerges: jazz as serious music, not sort of throwaway stuff that was just the subject matter of late night, boozy jam sessions in noisy clubs, but serious music where people dressed up and listened quietly, and there were subtleties in the music and blending in not just obviously jazz, but classical and other kinds of forms. This emerges as the ethos of the MJQ. It was largely John Lewis's influence. He was the great musical theorist of the group. He'd been part of that cerebral jazz collective around Gil Evans and Miles Davis, which had led to the birth of the Cool Sessions at the end of the 40s and early 50s. And the more they explored in that direction, the further they got at points from the more dominant bluesy hard bop feel that was so current in New York at the time. And the stresses of the group began to grow. Pretty soon, by about 1955, Kenny Clark leaves, feeling that, as he said, he wasn't prepared to keep playing 18th century drawing room jazz. Connie Kay comes in on drums at that point, and that version of the MJQ, with Jackson, Lewis, Kay, and Heath, endures pretty much nonstop for the next 2 decades, and then again on and off until the 1990s. As I mentioned, compared to the vibrant nature of hard bop, the modern jazz quartet's approach, which had no horns, first of all, and had vibes and piano essentially as the front line, could be pretty bloodless if Milt Jackson's funky touch and compositions weren't to the fore, as they often weren't. And although he was committed to the project, and he and Lewis had a solid creative partnership, really, as I mentioned, for a couple of decades, he also wanted to swing, as he would confess in interviews years later when he left the group. And as the MJQ starts to move in this third stream direction, a regular feature of Jackson's solo work in the 1950s and 1960s was work which was much bluesier and much funkier. One suspects that this was a necessary outlet, and some of this music, whether it was as a leader or as a sideman, is amongst the best modern jazz ever recorded. Here I'm thinking about the kind of music which was, for instance, immortalized on Miles Davis's famous record Bag's Groove, which of course features Milt Jackson's most famous composition. The records he makes between 1954 and 1959 include some swinging masterpieces like this fantastic 10-inch record, actually, and it's actually quite hard to find. It's not listed on his Wikipedia discography, but you can find it on Discogs. It's actually released under the Milt Jackson Quintet, and it's a tremendous group. It includes Heath and Clark from the MJQ, the great funky piano player Horace Silver, and the relatively obscure trumpeter Henry Bouzier. That one's on Prestige from 1954. In the mid-1950s, Jackson records his non-MJQ stuff for Savoy. Here's an example of that. The stuff is kind of hit and miss, I think. This is Rollin' Bags. It's a pretty indifferent record. Some of it's recorded actually in 1949. The latter half, this side two of the record, is from 1955 or 56, and that's actually much better. I find that the Savoy records in general tend to swing a little less hard than that Prestige record did, for instance. In my view, Jackson's career as a leader only really takes off when he, along with the rest of the MJQ, signed with Atlantic Records in 1956. In the next 5 or 6 years, Jackson releases a string of records as a leader, which are typically all-star dates with top-ranked musicians, and the music is beautifully recorded at Atlantic's new studios, usually by the great engineer Tom Dowd. And most, though maybe not all of these records, are classics. You will never regret, for instance, picking up a copy of this one, Ballads and Blues, which I think was his full debut on Atlantic, or this joint collaboration with Coleman Hawkins, Beanbags, and of course this famous collaboration with John Coltrane, Bags and Train, is also a tremendous record that he did with Ray Charles called Soul Brothers. And of course, this hot streak also includes this record, recorded in 1957, when Jackson was really hitting his stride. This record was made on 2 different dates in January 1957, the 5th and the 7th of January, at Atlantic's still pretty new studios at 157 West 57th. Nisui Erdogan is the producer, and the engineer is not Tom Dowd, but actually the relatively lesser-known Johnny Q. Because of Atlantic's habit of recording Jackson with all-star configurations, the record is different on its 2 different sides. There are only 4 contributors who are constant all the way through. Those are Jackson, of course, on vibes, the Basie alumnus Joe Newman on trumpet, the hard bop innovator and general all-around great piano player Horace Silver, all complemented by the tremendous arranging skills of Quincy Jones. And Jones's contribution to this album, I think, is decisive. Side 1 is performed by a nonette, and the 6 additional players are Jimmy Cleveland on trombone, Cannonball Adderley using the pseudonym Ronnie Peters on alto sax, Frank Foster on tenor, Sahib Shihab on baritone sax, Percy Heath on bass, and Art Blakey on drums. Not too shabby. Side 2 is more stripped down to a sextet, and here Jackson, Silver, and Newman are joined by Lucky Thompson on tenor, by Oscar Pettiford on bass, and by Jackson's MJQ colleague Connie Kay on drums. So as you can see, Jackson here is supported by some of his MJQ friends, but also a whole lot of other talent. Side 1, which was all recorded on January the 7th, starts off with the title track, Plenty Plenty Soul, which is a co-written composition by Milt Jackson and Quincy Jones. It's a long track. It's a great track. It's got a fantastic riff. It has Quincy Jones, frankly, written all over it. It's got this hooky, infectious riff, like I mentioned. It's well arranged. It's a tasteful kind of little big band. It's so predictive of the kind of work that Jones was to do over the next decade or so in the jazz world. It also has real variety amongst the 5 different horn players in terms of style, and then Milt cuts through all that horn sound with those crystalline vibe tones. The only sour note, and your mileage may vary, is the piano. I'm a massive fan of Horace Silver. I love the albums that he released for Blue Note as a leader, but I have a feeling that as a natural band leader and a leader of a group, I don't know how well he slotted into playing other people's arrangements. Maybe that didn't suit him, because at points, certainly in the first side of this LP, he really seems kind of anonymous. And when he does solo, it doesn't have that same funky flair. The next track is Boogity Boogity. It's a Jones composition. It's got that same classic Quincy Jones feel, the same great horn work, lovely vibes, same slightly lackluster piano, sorry Horace. And the side concludes with Heartstrings, which is a ballad. It's the first sole original by Milt on the record. To the extent that you can rip on a ballad, he completely rips, as does Cannonball. This is gorgeous. Side 2 is comprised of 4 tracks which were recorded 2 days previously on the 5th. And again, this is a sextet. It starts off with a track by Cannonball called Sermonette, which has a mellow intro by Milt, but then it kind of gives way to this swinging mid-tempo bounce. Again, very typical of Quincy Jones arrangements. And maybe it's Pettiford's influence, but this sounds a little bit more old school, as do some other moments on side 2. You do get a much more appealing and much more typical Horace Silver solo as you do for the rest of the side. Next is the Spirit Feel, which is a 12-bar blues, which again was a real kind of go-to form for Jackson as a composer. You get a real feel for Lucky Thompson's tone and sound on tenor, very similar to Stan Getz, I think, actually. I'll say parenthetically, I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg. Then something called Ignant Oil. This is a low-key, mid-tempo tune, which is a tremendous platform for what I think is Jackson's most appealing solo on the whole record. It's also probably Thompson's best work on the record as well. It's just this excellent, cathartic, late-night jazz. This is the track where I realized, okay, this really is a great record. And the final track is Blues at Twilight, which is exactly what it says on the tin. It's true to the title. It's like your spinal column being injected with some kind of slow groove serum, and the vibes are a major highlight. Regular viewers of this channel will know that I have not always been a big embracer of the vibes, but this is a record which might make a vibes fan out of the vibes avoidant, or at least the vibes curious. It's also a record which I believe should be included in any discussion of Milt Jackson's best work outside of the MJQ, or maybe his best work in any setting. It's also interesting because it's one of those records where the leader may arguably be less influential than another contributor, like, for instance, Cannonball's Something Else, which is basically a Miles Davis date. To me, Quincy Jones invigorates this whole record with his bouncy, ebullient arrangements, which are so typical of his work and which aren't always present on some other Milt Jackson dates. In any event, the combination here worked extremely well. I highly recommend picking this up, and for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.